There are certain phone calls that emergency dispatchers never forget, the ones that stick with them long after their shifts end, that echo in the quiet moments, that make them question how the world can hold such darkness. November 3rd, 2018 started like any other Saturday in northeast Miami-Dade, Florida. The sun was bright, the humidity hung thick in the air, and 911 operators were fielding the usual weekend calls. Traffic accidents, medical emergencies, domestic disputes. But then a call came through that would unravel one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse Florida had seen in years. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who identified herself as a registered nurse. Her tone was strangely measured, almost clinical, as she reported that her 7-year-old adopted daughter had stopped breathing. No panic, no hysteria, just a cold recitation of facts. The child had been sick for several days, she explained. Respiratory issues. She hadn't thought it was serious enough to seek medical attention. But now the little girl wasn't responsive. Paramedics were dispatched immediately to the apartment complex on Northeast 6th Avenue. As they rushed through Miami's streets, sirens blaring, they had no idea they were about to walk into what investigators would later describe as a house of horrors. They expected a tragic but straightforward case, a child succumbing to illness, perhaps pneumonia or complications from an infection. What they found instead would haunt them for the rest of their careers. When first responders entered Gina Emmanuel's apartment, the air itself felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. And there, on a bed in one of the small bedrooms, lay 7-year-old Samaya Emmanuel. The paramedics approached quickly, their training kicking in as they assessed the situation. But even seasoned emergency medical professionals, people who had seen car crashes and gunshot wounds and every manner of human suffering, froze when they got a closer look at the child. Samaya's tiny body was emaciated, her bones visible through paper-thin skin. But it wasn't just the malnourishment that stopped them cold. Her body was covered in injuries. Burns, scratches, open wounds that had never been treated, bruises in various stages of healing painting a grotesque map of abuse across her flesh. Her hands showed clear signs of burns, the kind that come from direct contact with extreme heat. There were marks on her wrists and ankles, consistent with restraints. Whip-like lacerations crisscrossed her back and legs. The paramedics looked at each other, then at Gina Emmanuel, who stood nearby with an expression that one first responder would later describe as eerily blank. This wasn't pneumonia. This was torture. They worked frantically, trying to revive the little girl, but Samaya Emmanuel was already gone. Her small body had endured more pain than most adults could imagine, and in the end it had simply given up. As police officers arrived at the scene and began securing the apartment, they made another chilling discovery. Samaya had not suffered alone. 2 other girls, ages 5 and 12, were found inside the apartment. Both were Samaya's biological sisters, and both had also been adopted by Gina Emmanuel. The officers took one look at these children and immediately called for additional medical assistance. The sisters were in shocking condition. Like Samaya, they were severely malnourished, their bodies bearing the unmistakable signs of prolonged physical abuse. Burns, bruises, cuts, scars. The 12-year-old girl weighed barely 50 pounds. The 5-year-old was so small and frail that she looked more like a toddler. Both children flinched when officers approached them, their eyes wide with a terror that spoke of unspeakable experiences. As detectives began processing the scene, the true horror of what had been happening inside that Miami apartment became clear. The refrigerator was chained shut with a heavy padlock, ensuring the starving children couldn't access food. Investigators found restraints, belts, brushes, back scratchers, and other implements that had clearly been used as weapons. The children's bedroom was sparse, almost prison-like, with minimal furniture and no toys, no books, nothing that would indicate children lived there. In the bathroom, detectives discovered bleach bottles, and later testimony would reveal that Emmanuel had forced the girls to drink the toxic substance as punishment. The stove in the kitchen became a crime scene unto itself when investigators realized it had been used to burn the children's hands. Every corner of that apartment told a story of systematic, calculated cruelty inflicted upon three innocent children by the very person who was supposed to protect them. And here's what made the whole situation even more incomprehensible. Gina Emmanuel wasn't some unknown figure living on society's fringes. She was a registered nurse, a licensed medical professional who had taken an oath to do no harm. She had worked in healthcare facilities, caring for patients, trusted with people's lives. She had passed background checks. She had been approved by the state of Florida to not only foster children, but to adopt them permanently. How does someone whose job is to heal become someone who tortures? How does a person trained to recognize medical emergencies withhold treatment from a dying child? These questions would plague investigators, prosecutors, and the public as the case unfolded. But on that November day in 2018, the immediate concern was clear. Samaya Emmanuel was dead. Her sisters were fighting for their lives, and Gina Emmanuel needed to answer for what she had done. To understand how this nightmare was allowed to continue for years, you have to understand who Gina Emmanuel appeared to be. On the surface, she was exactly the kind of person the foster care system hopes to find. A professional woman with a stable career, a home, and the desire to help children in need. She lived in a modest apartment in northeast Miami-Dade, a working-class area where neighbors looked out for each other and kids played in courtyards until the streetlights came on. Emmanuel, then in her early 50s, had built what seemed like a respectable life. Her career as a registered nurse gave her financial stability and social standing. Nursing is a profession built on compassion, on caring for the vulnerable, on easing suffering. It's a job that requires patience, empathy, and a genuine desire to help others. Gina Emmanuel had somehow passed all the tests, earned all the certifications, and convinced everyone around her that she possessed these qualities. But Emmanuel's involvement with vulnerable individuals extended beyond her nursing career. She also operated a group home for disabled adults in Miami. This meant that multiple people with developmental disabilities, physical challenges, or mental health needs were under her care, dependent on her for their daily needs, their safety, their well-being. The state of Florida had approved her to run this facility. She had been trusted with some of society's most vulnerable members. Think about the irony here, the profound, sickening irony. A woman who was professionally and legally responsible for caring for others, for protecting them, for ensuring their health and safety, was simultaneously running a torture chamber for three little girls in her own home. She would go to work, tend to patients or residents, present herself as a caregiver, and then return home to brutalize children. Neighbors who lived near Emmanuel's apartment would later tell reporters and investigators that they had no idea what was happening inside. They saw Gina Emmanuel as a quiet, private woman who kept to herself. She wasn't friendly exactly, but she wasn't hostile either. She would offer a polite nod in the hallway, maybe a brief comment about the weather. Nothing that stood out. Nothing that raised red flags. Some neighbors vaguely remembered seeing the girls at some point years earlier, but Emmanuel had pulled them out of school and essentially made them disappear from public view. In a bustling apartment complex where people came and went, where families with children were common, three little girls had simply vanished into the shadows and nobody noticed. Or if they noticed, they didn't think to question it. This is one of the most chilling aspects of child abuse cases. They happen in plain sight, behind closed doors that look exactly like everyone else's doors. The abuse unfolds in apartments and houses on regular streets, in communities where neighbors wave to each other and mail carriers make their daily rounds. Evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like a monster. It looks like a nurse coming home from her shift. It looks like an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. But there was nothing ordinary about what Gina Emmanuel was doing to Samaya, to her sisters, to three children who had already experienced trauma before they ever entered her home. These girls had been in the foster care system, which meant they had already been removed from their biological family due to circumstances that made it unsafe for them to remain. They had already experienced loss, displacement, uncertainty, and the system, designed to protect them, had placed them directly into the hands of their abuser. The story of how Samaya and her sisters ended up in Gina Emmanuel's care is a story about a broken system, about good intentions paved over with bureaucratic failures and dangerous gaps in oversight. To understand the full scope of this tragedy, you have to go back to 2014, 4 years before Samaya's death, when three young sisters were placed into Florida's foster care system. The reasons children enter foster care are always painful: abuse, neglect, parental substance addiction, domestic violence, incarceration, mental health crises. Whatever the specific circumstances, it always means that a child's biological family is unable or unwilling to provide safe care. For Samaya and her sisters, whatever had happened in their early years was severe enough that the state determined they needed to be removed. In 2014, Samaya would have been around 3 years old. Her sisters were even younger and slightly older, a spread of ages that meant they had different developmental needs but shared a crucial bond. They were sisters, they had each other, and child welfare agencies typically try to keep siblings together when possible. Being separated from your entire family is traumatic enough. Being separated from your siblings on top of that can be devastating. The three girls were placed together in foster care, and this is where Gina Emmanuel entered their lives. She applied to become a foster parent and was approved by the Florida Department of Children and Families. The approval process for foster parents involves background checks, home visits, interviews, and training. Emmanuel passed all of these requirements. Her nursing career likely worked in her favor. She had a documented history of caring for others. She had a stable income. She had space in her home. On paper, Gina Emmanuel looked like an ideal foster parent. In reality, she was about to subject three children to years of horrific abuse. But here's something that should have changed everything. Between 2012 and 2015, Samaya's name had appeared in 10 different child abuse hotline reports. 10. That's not a typo. 10 separate reports involving this little girl had been filed with Florida's abuse hotline. The details of these reports have not been fully released to the public, which is standard practice to protect the identities and privacy of children involved. But the fact that 10 reports were filed means that multiple people, at multiple times, saw something concerning enough to pick up the phone and report suspected abuse or neglect. Teachers, daycare workers, medical professionals, concerned relatives, neighbors, someone kept calling, kept raising alarms. And yet Samaya remained in Gina Emmanuel's care. This raises agonizing questions. Were the reports investigated? If so, what were the findings? Did social workers visit the home? Did they interview the children? Were the reports substantiated or dismissed? If they were substantiated, why weren't the children removed? If they were dismissed, what led investigators to believe there was no cause for concern? The foster care system is overwhelmed in nearly every state in America. Social workers carry caseloads that are far beyond what any reasonable person could manage effectively. There aren't enough foster homes. There isn't enough funding. There isn't enough oversight. Children slip through the cracks not because people don't care, but because the system is fundamentally broken, stretched so thin that even multiple reports of potential abuse can get lost in the shuffle. During the time the girls were in foster care, there were required monthly check-ins. Social workers were supposed to visit the home regularly, assess the children's well-being, meet with Emmanuel, ensure everything was going smoothly. These visits are designed to catch problems early, to intervene before situations escalate. But monthly visits to a foster home are brief, often scheduled in advance, and rely heavily on what the foster parent chooses to show the caseworker. An experienced abuser knows how to put on a show, clean up the house before the visit, make sure the children are dressed nicely, coach them on what to say, present a picture of a loving, stable home, and if the children are too afraid to speak up, if they've been threatened or manipulated into silence, a 30-minute visit once a month isn't going to uncover the truth. Still, for those first few years, there was at least some oversight. Someone from the state was checking in, even if those checks were inadequate. The girls were enrolled in school, where teachers and counselors might notice signs of abuse. There were still eyes on them, even if those eyes failed to see clearly. But all of that was about to change, because in 2017, Gina Emmanuel made a decision that would seal Samaya's fate. She decided to adopt all three girls permanently. Adoption is supposed to be a beautiful thing. It's meant to be the moment when a foster child finds permanency, when the uncertainty ends and a child finally has a forever family. It's supposed to represent safety, stability, love. The day an adoption is finalized is often celebrated with cake and balloons, with judges offering warm congratulations, with families taking photos to commemorate the occasion. For most adoptive families, this is exactly what adoption is, a joyous beginning. But for Samaya and her sisters, their adoption by Gina Emmanuel in 2017 was the beginning of the end. Because there's a dangerous loophole in the child welfare system, a gap in oversight that has been criticized by advocates for years, and Emmanuel knew exactly how to exploit it. Here's the loophole. Once a foster child is adopted, the monthly check-ins from child welfare services stop completely. The reasoning behind this policy makes sense on a surface level. Adoption means the child is no longer in state custody. The adoptive parents have full legal rights and responsibilities, just like any biological parent. The state doesn't conduct monthly welfare checks on children living with their biological parents, so why would they do so for adopted children? But this policy fails to account for the reality that some people foster and adopt children not out of love, but for other reasons. Financial benefits in some cases, as foster parents and adoptive parents may receive subsidies to help with the costs of raising children with special needs or trauma histories. Control and power in other cases, as abusers are drawn to vulnerable victims who are completely dependent on them. And once an adoption is finalized, those children essentially disappear from the system that was supposed to protect them. When Emmanuel adopted Samaya and her sisters in 2017, the monthly social worker visits ended immediately. There was no transition period, no gradually reduced oversight. One day there were scheduled check-ins, and the next day the case was closed. The girls, who were now 6, 8, and 14, approximately, were completely at Emmanuel's mercy. And Emmanuel wasted no time in asserting total control. One of the first things she did was pull the girls out of school, all three of them. She claimed she would homeschool them, which is a legal option in Florida and one that doesn't require extensive state approval or oversight. Homeschooling can be wonderful for children who thrive in that environment, but it can also be used as a tool of isolation by abusers who don't want teachers or counselors noticing signs of mistreatment. Once the girls were out of school, they had no regular contact with mandated reporters, people who are legally required to report suspected child abuse. Teachers, school nurses, counselors, coaches. These are the people most likely to notice when a child comes to school with unexplained injuries, when they seem fearful, when they're underweight or wearing inappropriate clothing for the weather to cover bruises. Remove children from school, and you remove one of the most important safety nets. Emmanuel also isolated the girls socially. They didn't play with other children in the apartment complex. They weren't enrolled in activities, sports, or community programs. They didn't attend church or any kind of regular social gathering where other adults might interact with them. They were kept inside the apartment, hidden away, their existence known only to Emmanuel. This level of isolation is a massive red flag for abuse, and it's exactly what Emmanuel wanted. She had created a situation where she had absolute power over three children with no oversight, no accountability, and no witnesses. Whatever she did to them behind that closed door, nobody would know. And what she did was unspeakable. What happened inside Gina Emmanuel's apartment over the following months and years can only be described as torture. This wasn't discipline that got out of hand. This wasn't a parent losing their temper in a moment of stress. This was systematic, intentional, prolonged abuse inflicted upon children who had no escape, no help, no voice. The details of the abuse are difficult to recount, but they're necessary to understand the full scope of Emmanuel's cruelty and the suffering these children endured. Court testimony from the surviving sisters, medical evidence, and investigators' findings paint a picture of almost unimaginable brutality. Emmanuel beat the children regularly with various implements: belts, wooden brushes, back scratchers, anything she could use to inflict pain. The beatings left marks across the girls' bodies, bruises layered on top of bruises, welts that never had time to heal before new ones appeared. The 12-year-old sister would later testify in court about these beatings, describing how Emmanuel would strike them over and over, how they would cry and beg her to stop, how she wouldn't. But the physical beatings were only one form of torture. Emmanuel also burned the children's hands on the kitchen stove. Deliberately, she would force them to place their hands on hot burners as punishment for perceived infractions. Think about the level of cruelty required to do that to a child. To watch a little girl's hands sizzle on a hot stove, to hear her screams, to smell burning flesh, and to keep her hand there. The pain would have been excruciating. The burns would take weeks to heal, if they ever fully healed. And every time the children looked at their own hands, they would be reminded of their powerlessness. Emmanuel also forced the children to drink bleach. Household bleach is a toxic substance that can cause severe chemical burns to the mouth, throat, esophagus, and stomach. It can cause vomiting, difficulty breathing, and in severe cases, organ damage or death. Emmanuel used it as a punishment, making these children consume poison. The immediate physical pain would have been terrible, but the psychological impact of being forced to drink something you know could kill you is its own kind of torture. Food, or rather the lack of it, was another weapon in Emmanuel's arsenal. The girls were starved to the point of severe malnourishment. The refrigerator was chained shut with a heavy padlock, ensuring they couldn't access food when Emmanuel wasn't home or when she decided they didn't deserve to eat. By the time of Samaya's death, the 7-year-old's body was so emaciated that medical examiners were shocked. Her sisters weren't much better off. The 12-year-old weighed barely 50 pounds, far below a healthy weight for her age. Starvation is a particularly cruel form of abuse because it's constant. You can't escape hunger. It gnaws at you every minute of every day. Children are especially vulnerable because their bodies are still growing and developing, requiring proper nutrition. Denying them food doesn't just cause pain and weakness in the moment. It causes long-term developmental damage. Emmanuel also used restraints to control the children. She would tie them to furniture, chain them to beds, bind their hands and wrists. The marks from these restraints were visible on the girls' bodies when they were finally removed from the home. Being physically restrained is terrifying, especially for children. It strips away any sense of bodily autonomy. You can't move, can't escape, can't defend yourself. You're completely at the mercy of your captor. One particularly cruel punishment involved forcing the children to stand in stress positions for extended periods. Emmanuel would make them stand on one leg with their arms outstretched, sometimes in the hot Florida sun, for hours at a time. This is a torture technique that has been used in war and by authoritarian regimes. The pain starts as discomfort, but quickly becomes unbearable as muscles fatigue and cramp. Eventually, the person can't maintain the position, but if they lower their arms or put their foot down, they face additional punishment. The surviving sister testified that Emmanuel would chain us to our beds until she got back when she left the apartment. Imagine being a small child, chained to a bed, unable to move, unable to use the bathroom, unable to get water, unable to do anything but wait in terror for your abuser to return, and not knowing what mood she'll be in when she does, not knowing if this will be the day things get even worse. Emmanuel also engaged in what can only be described as degradation abuse. Court records indicate she forced the children to eat feces as punishment. This serves no purpose other than to humiliate and dehumanize. It's about breaking a person's spirit, making them feel worthless, reinforcing that they have no power and no dignity. The cumulative effect of this abuse on the children's psychological state is impossible to fully grasp. These were young girls in the prime of childhood when they should have been playing, learning, exploring the world, forming friendships, discovering who they were. Instead, they lived in a state of constant fear and pain. They went to bed hungry and hurting. They woke up not knowing what torment the new day would bring. Their world had shrunk to the walls of that apartment and the whims of a sadistic abuser. And through all of this, there was no escape. The girls couldn't run away. Where would they go? They couldn't call for help. They had no access to phones. They couldn't tell a teacher or a friend. They weren't in school and had no friends. They were trapped, and Gina Emmanuel knew it. She had engineered a situation where she could do whatever she wanted to these children, and nobody would stop her. In late October and early November 2018, Samaya Emmanuel began showing signs of serious illness. She was developing a respiratory infection, likely starting as a common cold or flu that her weakened, malnourished body couldn't fight off effectively. For a healthy child with proper nutrition and a strong immune system, a respiratory infection is usually manageable with rest, fluids, and basic care. But Samaya was far from healthy. Her body was already under immense stress from chronic malnutrition and ongoing abuse. Her immune system was compromised. She didn't have the physical reserves to fight off even a minor infection. And as the infection took hold and began to worsen, she desperately needed medical intervention. She needed antibiotics, fluids, respiratory support, hospital care. She needed a doctor, a nurse, someone with medical expertise to recognize the severity of her condition and provide treatment. The cruel irony is that she was living with a registered nurse. Gina Emmanuel had medical training. She knew how to assess symptoms. She understood respiratory distress. She could recognize the signs of pneumonia, difficulty breathing, rapid breathing, chest pain, fever, weakness. She knew that untreated pneumonia in a malnourished child could be fatal. She knew all of this, and she chose to do nothing. As the days passed, Samaya's condition deteriorated. The respiratory infection progressed to pneumonia, a serious lung infection that causes inflammation and fluid buildup in the air sacs. Breathing becomes increasingly difficult. The body struggles to get enough oxygen. For Samaya, whose body was already in such a fragile state, this was a medical emergency. But Emmanuel didn't call a doctor. She didn't take Samaya to an urgent care clinic or an emergency room. She didn't even attempt to treat the child with over-the-counter medications. She simply let Samaya suffer, let the infection rage through her small body, let her struggle for breath day after day. The surviving sisters witnessed Samaya's decline. They saw their little sister getting sicker, weaker, struggling to breathe. And they were powerless to help her, just as they had been powerless to stop any of the abuse. They could only watch and hope, perhaps pray, that somehow Samaya would get better or that someone would come to help. In her final days, Samaya's body began shutting down. The untreated pneumonia had progressed to a critical stage. Her oxygen levels were dangerously low. Her body, already ravaged by abuse and starvation, couldn't fight anymore. She was likely in tremendous pain, struggling for every breath, frightened and confused about what was happening to her. Medical examiners would later determine that Samaya also developed sepsis, a life-threatening condition that occurs when the body's response to infection causes widespread inflammation and organ damage. Sepsis can kill quickly if not treated aggressively with antibiotics and supportive care. For a child as compromised as Samaya, sepsis was essentially a death sentence without immediate hospitalization. On November 3, 2018, Samaya Emmanuel stopped breathing. Her small, battered body had endured everything it could possibly endure, and it finally gave out. She was 7 years old. 7 years of life, and so much of it had been filled with pain and fear and suffering that no child should ever experience. Only then, after Samaya had stopped breathing, did Gina Emmanuel pick up the phone and call 911, not when the infection first started, not when it progressed to pneumonia, not when Samaya developed sepsis. Only when the child was already dead or dying did Emmanuel decide to involve medical professionals. Perhaps she realized she couldn't hide a dead child in her apartment. Perhaps she thought she could claim it was a tragic but natural death from illness. Perhaps she convinced herself she hadn't really done anything wrong. When paramedics arrived and saw Samaya's body, they immediately knew this was no ordinary case of pneumonia. The child's body told a story of prolonged abuse and neglect. The burns, the wounds, the marks from restraints, the severe malnourishment, these were the signs of torture, not simple illness. And the more closely they examined Samaya and assessed the scene, the clearer it became that this little girl had been failed catastrophically by the person who was supposed to care for her. The medical examiner's report would detail the full extent of Samaya's injuries and the cause of her death. Untreated bacterial pneumonia complicated by sepsis, all occurring in the context of severe chronic malnutrition and ongoing physical abuse. In other words, Samaya died from an illness that should have been treatable, made fatal by deliberate medical neglect in a child whose body had already been destroyed by sustained torture. Samaya Emmanuel should be alive today. She should be a teenager now in school, hanging out with friends, discovering her interests and dreams. She should have had the chance to heal from her early trauma, to know safety and stability, to experience what it feels like to be truly loved and protected. Instead, she died in pain and fear at age 7, in an apartment where she had known nothing but cruelty. The discovery of Samaya's condition and the state of her sisters triggered an immediate and extensive investigation. Miami-Dade Police Department detectives, Child Protective Services investigators, and medical personnel all descended on the case. The priority was ensuring the surviving sisters received urgent medical care and were removed from Emmanuel's custody immediately. But investigators also knew they were looking at a potential homicide. The two surviving girls were rushed to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. Medical professionals documented their injuries, took photographs for evidence, and began the careful process of treating their various ailments. Beyond the physical care, these children also desperately needed psychological support. They had been living in a nightmare, and they would need extensive therapy and counseling to even begin processing what had happened to them. While the girls were being cared for, detectives began the meticulous work of processing Gina Emmanuel's apartment as a crime scene. Every room was photographed, every surface examined, every item cataloged. The chained refrigerator, the restraints, the implements used for beatings, all of it was documented and collected as evidence. Investigators also pulled medical records, school records, foster care files, and adoption documents. They interviewed neighbors, Emmanuel's coworkers, anyone who might have information about the children or Emmanuel's behavior. The autopsy of Samaya's body was critical to the investigation. The medical examiner conducted a thorough examination, documenting every injury, every scar, every sign of abuse. The autopsy confirmed that Samaya had died from untreated pneumonia and sepsis, but it also revealed the extensive trauma her body had suffered over time. The burns on her hands, the marks from restraints, the signs of chronic malnutrition and physical abuse, all of this was documented in meticulous detail. The medical examiner's findings were devastating but essential. They provided objective, scientific evidence of the abuse Samaya had endured. Defense attorneys might try to claim that injuries were accidental or exaggerated, but an autopsy doesn't lie. The physical evidence on Samaya's body told an undeniable story of systematic torture. As investigators dug deeper into Gina Emmanuel's background, disturbing questions began to emerge. How had she been approved as a foster and adoptive parent? What happened with those 10 abuse hotline reports about Samaya? Why had no one intervened despite apparent red flags? The investigation into Emmanuel inevitably became an investigation into system failures as well. Child Protective Services had to conduct an internal review of their handling of the case. How had monthly check-ins during the foster care period failed to detect the abuse? Had social workers actually visited the home as required, or had visits been skipped? If they had visited, what had they observed? Why hadn't the abuse hotline reports triggered more intensive intervention? These are painful questions without satisfying answers. The reality is that child welfare systems across the country are struggling with overwhelming caseloads, insufficient funding, and staff turnover. Social workers are often handling 30, 40, even 50 cases at once, making it nearly impossible to give each child the attention and oversight they deserve. And when children are adopted and disappear from the system entirely, there's no safety net at all. Detectives also had to interview Gina Emmanuel herself. These interrogations are critical in building a case. Investigators need to hear the suspect's version of events, observe their demeanor, look for inconsistencies or admissions. Emmanuel's interrogation provided insight into her mindset and her attempts to justify or explain away what she had done. According to investigators who were present, Emmanuel showed a disturbing lack of emotion when discussing Samaya's death and the condition of her other daughters. She wasn't sobbing or distraught, as you might expect from a mother who had just lost a child. Instead, she was detached, almost clinical, as if she were discussing a patient at work rather than her own daughter. This cold demeanor would be noted by everyone who interacted with her during the investigation and eventual trial. Emmanuel's explanations for the children's injuries and condition were inadequate and contradicted by evidence. She claimed the girls had medical conditions that explained their appearance. She suggested Samaya's untreated diabetes had contributed to her death, attempting to shift blame onto a disease rather than her own neglect. She downplayed the severity of the abuse, framing her actions as reasonable corporal punishment that had gotten misinterpreted. But the evidence told a different story. Investigators had photographs of the apartment, medical reports detailing the extent of the abuse, and most importantly, they had the testimony of the surviving sisters. These brave young girls, despite everything they had been through, would eventually be able to tell their story and help bring their abuser to justice. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case for investigators and the public was the timeline. Samaya died in November 2018, but Gina Emmanuel wasn't arrested until October 2019, nearly a full year later. This delay raised questions and concerns. Why did it take so long to arrest someone when the evidence seemed so clear? The reality of criminal investigations is that building a solid case takes time, especially in complex cases involving child abuse and homicide. Prosecutors need to ensure they have all the evidence properly documented and admissible in court. They need medical expert testimony lined up. They need to prepare child witnesses, which requires sensitivity and specialized training. Rushing to arrest without a solid case can result in charges being dismissed or an acquittal at trial, allowing the perpetrator to walk free. Still, the fact that Emmanuel remained at liberty for nearly a year after Samaya's death was troubling. More troubling still was the fact that she retained her nursing license during this time and continued to operate her group home for disabled individuals. This meant that vulnerable adults were still under her care, still depending on her, while she was under investigation for torturing children to death. It wasn't until public pressure mounted and media attention intensified that the state nursing board moved to suspend Emmanuel's license. The optics were terrible. A nurse under investigation for child murder and torture was still licensed to care for patients. But bureaucratic processes move slowly, and the board couldn't simply revoke someone's license without due process. When Emmanuel was finally arrested in October 2019, she was charged with first-degree murder in Samaya's death and aggravated child abuse for the torture of her surviving daughters. First-degree murder in Florida carries the possibility of life in prison or even the death penalty. The aggravated child abuse charges added additional potential prison time. If convicted on all counts, Emmanuel would never see freedom again. The arrest brought some measure of relief to investigators and the public, but it was just the beginning of a long legal process. Emmanuel was held without bond, deemed too dangerous to release pending trial. A judge also moved quickly to terminate her parental rights over the surviving daughters, ensuring she could never have access to them again. The girls were placed with family members who had been fighting for custody and who would provide them with the love and safety they should have had all along. From Emmanuel's arrest in October 2019 to her trial in April 2025, more than 5 years passed. This is not unusual for serious criminal cases, especially those involving the death penalty or life imprisonment. The legal system moves slowly, with numerous pretrial hearings, motions, evidence exchanges, and procedural steps that must be completed before a trial can proceed. For the surviving sisters and their extended family, this wait was agonizing. They wanted justice for Samaya. They wanted Emmanuel held accountable, but they also wanted to move forward with their lives, to heal from the trauma, to find some measure of peace. Every court appearance, every delay, every legal maneuver by the defense was a reminder of what had happened and what they had lost. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in early 2020, caused significant delays in court proceedings across the country. Trials were postponed, courts operated at reduced capacity, and the backlog of cases grew. This added to the frustration of those waiting for Emmanuel's trial, but there was no way to speed up the process. During these years, the surviving sisters were receiving intensive therapy and support. They were adjusting to life with family members who actually loved and cared for them. They were going to school, making friends, experiencing normalcy for the first time in years. But they were also living with the knowledge that they would eventually have to testify against Gina Emmanuel in court. Testifying in a criminal trial is difficult for anyone, but it's especially challenging for child victims of abuse. They have to recount traumatic experiences in front of strangers, with their abuser sitting in the courtroom watching them. They may face cross-examination by defense attorneys who will try to poke holes in their testimony. The entire experience can be re-traumatizing. Child advocacy centers and prosecutors work hard to prepare child witnesses and minimize the trauma of testifying. They explain what will happen in court, do practice runs, and provide support throughout the process. But there's no way to make it easy. These girls would have to relive their worst memories in order to help convict the woman who had tormented them. As the trial date finally approached in early 2025, anticipation built. The case had garnered significant media attention, both locally in Miami and nationally. It had all the elements that draw public interest. A trusted professional revealed as a monster, innocent children suffering unimaginable abuse, systemic failures that allowed it to continue, questions about how this could happen. State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle, the chief prosecutor for Miami-Dade County, issued statements emphasizing the gravity of the case and her office's commitment to seeking justice for Samaya and her sisters. This was a case that prosecutors knew they had to get right. The evidence was strong, but they would need to present it effectively and anticipate the defense's arguments. Emmanuel's defense team faced a nearly impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming. Samaya was dead, her body bearing the signs of torture. The surviving sisters could testify about what Emmanuel had done. Medical experts could explain the extent of the abuse and the cause of death. There were photographs, physical evidence, medical records. How do you defend someone against that? The defense strategy that emerged was essentially a two-pronged approach. First, claim that what prosecutors called torture was actually reasonable corporal punishment that may have gone too far but wasn't criminal. Second, argue that Samaya's death was due to undiagnosed or poorly managed diabetes and other medical conditions, not neglect. In other words, minimize the abuse and shift blame for the death. This strategy was always unlikely to succeed given the evidence, but it was perhaps the only option available to the defense. They couldn't claim Emmanuel didn't do it. There was too much evidence. They couldn't claim it was an accident. The abuse was too systematic and prolonged. So they had to try to reframe it, to argue that it wasn't as bad as it looked and that the death was really due to illness. As the trial began in April 2025, more than 6 years after Samaya's death, the courthouse in Miami-Dade County was crowded with media, victims' advocates, and members of the public who wanted to see justice served. Gina Emmanuel, now in her late 50s, sat at the defense table, showing the same cold, emotionless demeanor that had characterized her throughout the investigation. The trial of Gina Emmanuel began in April 2025 in a Miami-Dade County courtroom. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion as prosecutors prepared to present a case that would detail years of systematic torture inflicted upon 3 defenseless children. The jury, 12 ordinary citizens tasked with deciding Emmanuel's fate, would be forced to confront evidence so disturbing that some would struggle to maintain composure. Assistant state attorneys laid out their case in opening statements. They described how Emmanuel had taken in 3 foster children, adopted them, and then systematically tortured them over years. They explained how she had exploited the adoption system's oversight gap to create a private hell for these girls. They promised to present medical evidence, testimony from the surviving victims, and physical evidence that would prove beyond any doubt that Gina Emmanuel had murdered Samaya through intentional neglect and abuse. The prosecution's strategy was to build their case methodically, using multiple types of evidence to create an undeniable picture of guilt. They would present medical testimony about Samaya's injuries and cause of death. They would show photographs of the apartment and the implements of torture. They would call investigators who had processed the scene. And most powerfully, they would present testimony from the surviving sisters, including the 12-year-old who was now a young woman ready to tell her story. The defense's opening statement attempted to reframe the narrative. Emmanuel's attorneys argued that their client was a hardworking nurse who had taken in 3 troubled children with behavioral issues and special needs. They claimed that any discipline Emmanuel administered was within the bounds of reasonable corporal punishment, which is legal in Florida. They suggested that Samaya's death was the result of undiagnosed and untreated diabetes, not neglect, and that Emmanuel had done her best to care for a seriously ill child. This defense strategy was problematic from the start. Florida law does allow for reasonable corporal punishment, but there are limits. Punishment that causes serious physical injury, leaves marks and scars, or is administered with sadistic intent crosses the line into criminal abuse. And the defense's claim about diabetes was contradicted by medical evidence showing that pneumonia and sepsis, along with severe malnutrition and abuse, had killed Samaya. The prosecution's first witnesses were the first responders who had been called to Emmanuel's apartment on November 3, 2018. Paramedics described finding Samaya's body and their shock at her condition. They testified about the extensive injuries they observed, the evidence of malnutrition, and their growing realization that this was not a simple case of a child dying from illness. Police officers who had secured the scene testified about what they found in the apartment: the chained refrigerator, the restraints and implements used for beatings, the sparse, prison-like conditions in the children's bedroom. Their testimony, accompanied by photographs admitted into evidence, painted a disturbing picture of the environment where these girls had been forced to live. The medical examiner's testimony was critical to the prosecution's case. Dr. Emma Liu, a forensic pathologist, walked the jury through her autopsy findings. She showed photographs of Samaya's body, pointing out the burns, the scars from restraints, the wounds in various stages of healing. She explained how Samaya's severe malnutrition had compromised her immune system and her body's ability to fight infection. Dr. Liu testified that Samaya had died from bacterial pneumonia complicated by sepsis. She explained that while the immediate cause of death was the untreated infection, the underlying cause was the chronic abuse and medical neglect Samaya had suffered. A healthy child with proper nutrition and access to medical care would likely have survived pneumonia, But Samaya's body was so weakened by abuse and starvation that she couldn't fight off what should have been a treatable illness. The defense attempted to challenge the medical examiner's findings during cross-examination, suggesting that diabetes had contributed to Samaya's death. But Dr. Liu was firm in her conclusions. While Samaya may have had some blood sugar irregularities, diabetes was not a significant factor in her death. The primary factors were the pneumonia, sepsis, malnutrition, and chronic physical abuse. Other medical experts testified about the specific injuries Samaya and her sisters had sustained. Burn specialists explained the injuries to the children's hands, testifying that the patterns were consistent with forced contact with hot surfaces like stove burners. Pediatricians who had examined the surviving sisters testified about their malnourishment, estimating that the girls were receiving perhaps one meal per day at most, far below what growing children need. Child abuse experts also took the stand, explaining the psychological dynamics of child torture cases. They described how abusers isolate their victims, how they use fear and control to maintain power, and how children in these situations often don't report the abuse because they don't believe anyone will help them or they fear the consequences of speaking out. As the trial progressed through these expert witnesses, the evidence against Emmanuel became overwhelming. But the most powerful testimony was yet to come. The prosecution had saved the surviving sisters' testimony for later in the trial, understanding that their first-hand accounts would be the most compelling evidence. When the now teenaged older sister took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. This young woman, who had survived years of torture and watched her little sister die, was about to tell her story publicly for the first time. Prosecutors had worked with her extensively to prepare her for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare someone for the experience of testifying against their abuser. Speaking in a steady voice that betrayed her inner strength, the young woman described life in Gina Emmanuel's apartment. She testified about the beatings with belts, brushes, and back scratchers. She described how Emmanuel would burn their hands on the stove as punishment. She recounted being forced to drink bleach, the burning sensation in her throat, the fear that she was going to die. She testified about the starvation, the constant gnawing hunger, watching Emmanuel prepare food and lock it away where they couldn't reach it. She described being chained to furniture and beds, unable to move for hours. She spoke about the stress positions Emmanuel forced them to hold, the muscle cramps and exhaustion, the pain that wouldn't stop. And she testified about Samaya, about watching her little sister get sicker and sicker, knowing she needed a doctor, begging Emmanuel to get help, about Samaya's labored breathing, her weakness, her fear, about the day Samaya stopped breathing, the moment everything changed. Throughout this testimony, Emmanuel sat at the defense table showing no visible emotion. She didn't cry, didn't look away, didn't show any sign of remorse or regret. Her cold demeanor was noted by court observers and would later be remarked upon by the judge at sentencing. The defense's cross-examination of the surviving sister was brief and respectful. Emmanuel's attorneys knew that attacking a sympathetic teenage victim would backfire with the jury. Instead, they gently tried to suggest that her memory might not be entirely accurate, that time might have distorted her recollections. But the young woman stood firm, answering each question with clarity and conviction. The prosecution also presented evidence of the 10 abuse hotline reports that had been filed about Samaya between 2012 and 2015. Child welfare workers testified about these reports and the investigations that followed. Their testimony highlighted how the system had failed to adequately protect Samaya, even when multiple red flags were raised. The defense presented a relatively brief case, calling primarily character witnesses who testified that Emmanuel had been a good nurse and seemed to care about her patients. They called a medical expert who suggested that diabetes could have contributed to Samaya's death, though this expert's testimony was undermined on cross-examination when prosecutors pointed out that the expert hadn't examined Samaya's body or reviewed all the medical evidence. Emmanuel herself did not testify. Defendants have a constitutional right not to testify, and defense attorneys often advise their clients not to take the stand because it opens them up to cross-examination by prosecutors. Given Emmanuel's apparent lack of remorse and her cold demeanor, her attorneys likely feared that putting her on the stand would be disastrous. In closing arguments, prosecutors pulled together all the evidence into a cohesive narrative. They reminded the jury of the medical evidence, the testimony from first responders and investigators, the expert opinions, and most importantly, the testimony of the surviving sister. They argued that the evidence proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Gina Emmanuel had committed first-degree murder through intentional medical neglect and had committed aggravated child abuse against all three sisters. The defense's closing argument attempted to raise reasonable doubt, suggesting that Emmanuel had tried her best to care for children with difficult behaviors and medical needs. They argued that Samaya's death was a tragic accident, not murder, and that Emmanuel's discipline, while perhaps excessive, didn't rise to the level of criminal abuse. The jury began deliberations after receiving instructions from the judge on the relevant law. They had to determine whether the prosecution had proven each element of each charge beyond a reasonable doubt. First-degree murder required proving that Emmanuel had intentionally caused Samaya's death or had acted with depraved indifference to human life. Aggravated child abuse required proving that Emmanuel had intentionally tortured, maliciously punished, or willfully caused great bodily harm to the children. After deliberating for several hours, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreperson handed the verdict forms to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. Judge Christina Miranda reviewed the verdicts silently before asking the foreperson to read them aloud. In the matter of the state of Florida versus Gina Emmanuel, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Samaya Emmanuel, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Family members of the victims wept, some with relief, some with grief, some with both. The surviving sisters present in the courtroom held each other. State Attorney Catherine Fernandez-Rundle and her team allowed themselves brief smiles, knowing that justice was being served. On the charge of aggravated child abuse against victim 1, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the charge of aggravated child abuse against victim 2, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Guilty on all counts. Gina Emmanuel, the registered nurse who had tortured 3 children for years and caused the death of 1, had been convicted. She would face mandatory life in prison for the first-degree murder conviction, with additional time for the abuse charges. Emmanuel showed no reaction to the verdicts. She sat motionless, staring straight ahead, her expression blank. Even in the face of a conviction that would send her to prison for the rest of her life, she displayed no emotion, no remorse, no humanity. State Attorney Fernandez-Rundle addressed the media after the verdicts were read. The guilty verdict in Gina Emmanuel's first-degree murder and child abuse trial brought to light the horrors 7-year-old Samaya so tragically suffered before her death, she said. No one could ever imagine that a trained nurse would beat, torture, and starve Samaya and her sisters as a means of discipline. She continued, "This verdict represents justice not only for Samaya, who can no longer speak for herself, but also for her brave sisters who survived and had the courage to testify. These children deserved love, safety, and protection. Instead, they received cruelty from the very person who was supposed to care for them. Today's verdict ensures that Gina Emmanuel will never be able to harm another child." The conviction was a significant victory, but the case wasn't over yet. Sentencing would come later, giving the victims and their family the opportunity to address Emmanuel and the court, and giving the judge the chance to ensure Emmanuel received the maximum punishment allowed by law. On April 29, 2025, 2 weeks after the guilty verdicts, Gina Emmanuel returned to court for sentencing. Under Florida law, First-degree murder carries either life in prison without parole or the death penalty. Prosecutors had not sought the death penalty in this case, so Emmanuel faced mandatory life in prison plus additional time for the aggravated child abuse convictions. Sentencing hearings serve multiple purposes. They allow victims or their families to address the defendant and the court through victim impact statements. They give the defense a final opportunity to argue for leniency, and they allow the judge to explain the sentence and its reasoning. The most powerful moment of the sentencing hearing came when Ayanna Gordon, Emmanuel's oldest surviving daughter, addressed the court. Ayanna, who had testified during the trial, had prepared a victim impact statement for this moment. What she said would capture headlines and crystallize the feelings of everyone who had followed this case. Standing before the court, looking directly at Gina Emmanuel, Ayanna spoke with a strength that belied her young age. "You stole our childhood," she began. "You took away years we can never get back. You made us live in fear every single day. You hurt us, you starved us, you tortured us. And you killed Samaya." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I want you to know that we survived. Despite everything you did to break us, we're still here. We're healing. We have family who loves us and shows us what real love looks like. You failed to destroy us." Then came the line that would be quoted in news coverage around the world. "I hope you spend every day of the rest of your life thinking about what you did. I hope you never know a moment of peace. I wish you well in hell." The courtroom was silent except for the sounds of people crying. Even seasoned court reporters and prosecutors, people who had seen countless victim impact statements, were moved by Ayanna's words. This young woman, who had every right to be broken by her experiences, stood tall and spoke truth to her abuser. Emmanuel's reaction to Ayanna's statement was the same as her reaction to everything else. Nothing. She sat expressionless, offering no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. Other family members also gave victim impact statements. Samaya's grandfather spoke about the granddaughter he never got to see grow up. He described Samaya as she had been before entering Emmanuel's care, a bright, curious little girl with her whole life ahead of her. He spoke about the family's guilt and frustration that they hadn't been able to protect her and her sisters. "We tried to get custody," he said, his voice breaking. "We tried to bring them home, but the system chose her instead. And now Samaya is gone." When it was time for the defense to speak, Emmanuel's attorneys made a brief argument for some measure of leniency on the aggravated child abuse sentences, even though they knew the murder conviction meant life in prison regardless. They presented no mitigating factors because there really weren't any. Emmanuel had no history of mental illness that might explain her behavior. She wasn't acting in self-defense. She hadn't been under duress. She had simply, methodically, deliberately tortured 3 children for years. The defense did mention that Emmanuel had been a productive member of society, a healthcare professional who had helped others in her career. But this argument rang hollow in a courtroom where everyone had just heard about a nurse burning children's hands on stove burners and forcing them to drink bleach. Judge Christina Miranda then addressed the court before imposing sentence. Her remarks made clear that she understood the full gravity of what had occurred and the depth of Emmanuel's depravity. "Ms. Emmanuel," the judge began, looking directly at the defendant, "you were a registered nurse, someone trained to care for the sick and vulnerable. You operated a group home for disabled adults, people who depended on you. And you adopted 3 children who had already experienced trauma in their young lives, children who needed safety and love." The judge's voice grew harder. "Instead of providing care, you inflicted torture. Instead of healing, you caused pain. You starved children in your care. You beat them with various implements. You burned their hands on your stove. You forced them to drink poison. You chained them like animals. And when Samaya became gravely ill, you denied her medical care and watched her die." Judge Miranda continued, "What makes your crimes even more reprehensible is that you used your medical knowledge not to help these children, but to harm them while avoiding detection. You knew exactly how much abuse a small body could endure. You knew what injuries would heal and what marks would fade. You knew when Samaya was dying, and you chose to let it happen. The judge referenced the victim impact statements. We heard today from your daughter Ayana, who showed remarkable courage and strength. We heard from Samaya's grandfather, who grieves the loss of his granddaughter. These statements remind us that your crimes have rippled outward, causing pain not just to your direct victims, but to everyone who loved them. Then came the sentence. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Samaya Emmanuel, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the charge of aggravated child abuse against victim 1, I sentence you to 30 years in prison, to run consecutive to the life sentence. On the charge of aggravated child abuse against victim 2, I sentence you to 30 years in prison, to run consecutive to the previous sentences. Life in prison plus 60 years. Gina Emmanuel would die behind bars. She would never again have the opportunity to harm a child. She would spend her remaining years in a cell, cut off from the world, facing the consequences of her actions. As the judge finished pronouncing sentence, Emmanuel was led out of the courtroom by bailiffs. She would be transported to a Florida state prison for women, where she would begin serving her sentence. In prison, child abusers are among the most despised inmates, often facing harassment and violence from other prisoners. Emmanuel's crimes were particularly heinous, and her time behind bars would likely be difficult. But for Ayana and her surviving sister, for Samaya's grandfather and extended family, the sentencing brought a measure of closure. Justice had been served. The woman who had caused so much suffering would never hurt another child. Samaya's death had not been in vain. Her case had exposed systemic failures and brought attention to the need for reform. As the family left the courthouse, reporters asked Ayana how she felt. She paused, considering her words carefully, then said simply, "I feel like Samaya can rest now, and we can start to heal." The conviction and sentencing of Gina Emmanuel answered the question of individual criminal responsibility. She was guilty. She would be punished. But the case raised larger, more troubling questions about how this had been allowed to happen in the first place. How had a woman capable of such cruelty been approved as a foster and adoptive parent? How had years of abuse gone undetected despite multiple reports to abuse hotlines? How had 3 children essentially disappeared from oversight after their adoption? These questions don't have simple answers, but they demand examination because understanding system failures is essential to preventing future tragedies. Let's start with the foster care and adoption approval process. In theory, becoming a foster or adoptive parent in Florida requires passing background checks, completing training, undergoing home inspections, and being interviewed by social workers. The system is designed to screen out people who might harm children. But the system has significant limitations. Background checks only reveal past criminal convictions. If someone has never been caught committing abuse, their record is clean. Gina Emmanuel had no criminal history before adopting the girls. She was a licensed nurse in good standing. She operated a group home for disabled adults without any documented problems. On paper, she looked like an ideal candidate. The training that foster parents receive is often minimal, sometimes just a few hours of classes covering basic childcare and legal responsibilities. It doesn't include intensive psychological screening that might identify someone with sadistic tendencies or a desire to control and harm vulnerable individuals. And even if it did, skilled manipulators can pass psychological assessments by telling evaluators what they want to hear. Home inspections are similarly limited. A social worker visits the home to ensure it's clean, safe, and has adequate space for children. But a home inspection scheduled in advance gives potential abusers plenty of time to prepare. Clean the apartment, hide anything concerning, put on a good show. A 30-minute visit can't reveal what happens behind closed doors when no one is watching. The more serious system failure in Samaya's case was the response to the 10 abuse hotline reports filed between 2012 and 2015. 10 separate calls from concerned individuals about a child in potential danger should have triggered intensive investigation and intervention. But for various reasons, overwhelmed caseworkers, insufficient evidence to substantiate claims, investigative failures, Samaya remained in Emmanuel's care. Child abuse hotlines receive thousands of calls, and not all of them are substantiated upon investigation. Sometimes calls are made by people involved in custody disputes, trying to use the system as a weapon. Sometimes calls are based on misunderstandings or misinterpretations of what someone saw. And sometimes there simply isn't enough evidence to legally remove a child from a home, even when social workers suspect abuse is occurring. The legal standard for removing a child is high, as it should be. The state can't simply take children away from parents based on suspicion or allegations alone. There must be evidence that the child is in immediate danger. If a social worker visits a home and sees a clean apartment, children who aren't showing obvious signs of fresh injuries, and a foster parent who seems cooperative, it can be difficult to justify removal, especially if the children have been coached not to disclose abuse. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of child protection work. Social workers often suspect something is wrong, feel in their gut that a child isn't safe, but don't have enough concrete evidence to act. They make a note in the file, maybe schedule a follow-up visit, but ultimately have to leave the child in a situation that makes them uncomfortable. And then they move on to the next case on their overwhelming caseload, hoping they made the right call. Samaya's case, we don't know exactly what each of those 10 hotline reports alleged or how they were investigated. The details haven't been made public, and they may never be. But the fact that 10 reports didn't result in removal suggests either that investigators couldn't substantiate the claims or that the abuse wasn't obvious during home visits. Emmanuel, with her nursing background and understanding of how the system works, likely knew exactly how to present a facade of appropriate care. The most critical system failure, however, was the complete cessation of oversight after the adoption was finalized in 2017. This is a gap in child welfare policy that advocates have been criticizing for years. When children are in foster care, there's at least some oversight, however inadequate. Monthly check-ins, school attendance tracking, medical appointments documented in files. But once an adoption is finalized, all of that disappears. The reasoning behind this policy is understandable. Adoption is meant to create a permanent, normal family situation. The state doesn't monitor biological families, so why should adoptive families be treated differently? Continued oversight could be seen as intrusive and as sending a message that adoptive families aren't real families. But this reasoning fails to account for the reality that foster-to-adopt situations involve children with trauma histories and adults who may have motivations beyond simply wanting to provide a loving home. Some people foster and adopt for the financial subsidies available for children with special needs. Some do it for the sense of power and control over vulnerable individuals. Some do it because children removed from their biological families and isolated from extended family and community support are ideal victims for predators. There needs to be a middle ground, not intrusive monitoring of every adoptive family, which would be impractical and insulting to the vast majority of loving adoptive parents, but perhaps continued check-ins for a period after adoption, especially in cases where there had been previous reports of concern. Maybe mandatory school enrollment with exemptions only granted after careful review of homeschooling plans. Maybe annual wellness checks by medical professionals who are trained to spot signs of abuse. When Emmanuel pulled the girls out of school after adopting them, that should have been a red flag. Homeschooling is legal and can be wonderful for many children, but it can also be a tool of isolation for abusers. When children suddenly disappear from school shortly after an adoption, someone should be asking questions. Where are the girls? What curriculum are they following? Can a social worker meet with them to ensure they're thriving? But no one asked those questions because once the adoption was finalized, no one was paying attention anymore. The case was closed. The girls were no longer the state's responsibility, and Emmanuel had exactly what she wanted: complete control over 3 vulnerable children with no accountability to anyone. The Emmanuel case also highlights broader issues with how we handle child abuse reporting and investigation. The fact that multiple people called abuse hotlines about Samaya over the years suggests that people in the community were noticing concerning signs. Teachers, perhaps, neighbors, medical professionals, family members. People were worried enough to make reports. But reporting abuse is just the first step. Those reports must be investigated promptly and thoroughly. Investigators need training to recognize signs of abuse that aren't immediately obvious. They need time to build rapport with children so the kids feel safe disclosing what's happening. They need to look beyond a clean apartment and a cooperative parent to the reality of what children are experiencing. This requires resources, more social workers so caseloads are manageable, better training so investigators know what to look for and how to conduct effective interviews with traumatized children, technology and tools to help identify patterns across multiple reports, collaboration between different agencies so information doesn't fall through the cracks. It also requires holding agencies accountable when they miss signs of abuse or fail to follow up appropriately. The Florida Department of Children and Families conducted an internal review after Samaya's death, but the results of that review weren't made public. Were social workers disciplined for missing warning signs? Were policies changed? What specific reforms were implemented to prevent similar tragedies? These questions matter because Samaya isn't the only child to die after being adopted from foster care. These cases happen across the country with disturbing regularity. Children are removed from one dangerous situation, placed with foster families who are supposed to protect them, adopted to create permanency, and then abused or killed with no one watching closely enough to intervene. State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle addressed some of these systemic issues in her statement after the verdict. This case also highlights the critical need for continued vigilance in protecting our most vulnerable children, she said. When children are adopted from foster care, they don't stop needing protection. We must ensure there are safeguards in place to keep them safe even after adoption. She called for policy reforms including extended oversight of adoptive families, mandatory school enrollment or stringent homeschooling oversight, and better training for social workers to recognize signs of abuse. Whether these reforms will be implemented remains to be seen. Policy change is slow, especially when it requires funding and political will. But if Samaya's death can lead to changes that save even one other child, then at least some meaning can be found in this tragedy. That's what advocates and reformers hope for, that the horror of this case will be a catalyst for the systemic changes that are desperately needed. While the legal case against Gina Emmanuel concluded with her conviction and sentencing, the impact of her crimes will last far longer, particularly for the 2 sisters who survived. These young women, now in their teens and early 20s, face the challenging task of healing from years of trauma and building lives free from abuse. After being removed from Emmanuel's apartment in November 2018, both sisters received immediate medical care for their physical injuries and malnutrition. But physical healing is only one part of recovery. The psychological scars from sustained childhood torture run deep and require intensive, long-term therapeutic intervention. The girls were placed with family members who had been fighting for custody, relatives who actually loved them and wanted to provide the safe, nurturing environment they deserved. For the first time in years, they experienced what family is supposed to be: a source of support, comfort, and unconditional love. But adjusting to normal family life after years of abuse isn't easy. The girls had to relearn basic trust. They had to understand that food would be available when they were hungry, that they wouldn't be punished for minor mistakes, that the adults in their lives actually cared about their well-being. These concepts, which most children take for granted, were foreign to them. They also had to process the trauma they had experienced and witnessed. Therapy is essential for survivors of severe abuse, but it's not a quick fix. Trauma-informed therapy helps survivors understand that what happened to them wasn't their fault, teaches them coping skills for managing traumatic memories and triggers, and helps them develop a sense of self beyond being a victim. For the older sister, Anna, therapy also involved preparing to testify at Emmanuel's trial. This process required revisiting traumatic memories in detail, something that can be re-traumatizing in itself. But Anna showed remarkable courage and determination to ensure Emmanuel was held accountable. Her willingness to testify was crucial to the prosecution's case and demonstrated a strength that will undoubtedly serve her well as she continues healing and building her future. Both sisters are now enrolled in school, experiencing education in a normal environment for the first time in years. They're making friends, discovering interests and talents, participating in activities that were denied to them during their years with Emmanuel. These normal childhood and adolescent experiences are part of the healing process, showing them that life can be good, that the world isn't all darkness and pain. The girls also carry the memory of Samaya, their little sister who didn't survive. Survivor's guilt is common among people who lived through tragedies that killed others. Why did I survive when she didn't? Could I have done something to save her? These questions likely haunt both sisters, even though intellectually they understand they were children themselves, powerless to stop Emmanuel. Processing grief while also processing trauma is a complex psychological challenge. The sisters grieve not just for Samaya's death, but for the childhood all three of them lost, for the innocence that was stolen, for the years they can never get back. Grief doesn't follow a linear path, and healing from abuse doesn't either. There will be good days and hard days, steps forward and setbacks. But what's clear from Anna's victim impact statement and her public appearances is that these young women are determined not to let Emmanuel win. They're committed to healing, to building good lives, to honoring Samaya's memory by thriving despite everything they endured. That determination, combined with proper support and therapy, gives hope that both sisters can eventually find peace. Their story also represents hope for other survivors of childhood abuse. Recovery is possible. Trauma doesn't have to define your entire life. With proper support, therapy, and love from people who genuinely care, survivors can heal and go on to live fulfilling lives. It's not easy, and the scars never completely disappear, but it is possible. The family has remained largely private since Emmanuel's sentencing, understandably wanting to move forward without constant public attention and media scrutiny. They've asked for privacy as the girls continue healing, and that request should be respected. These young women have had enough of their privacy violated, enough of their lives exposed. They deserve the chance to heal away from cameras and reporters. What we know is that both sisters are alive, safe, and surrounded by people who love them. That's more than they had for years under Emmanuel's control. And while the trauma they experienced will always be part of their story, it doesn't have to be the end of their story. They get to write the next chapters, and those chapters can be filled with healing, growth, joy, and hope. One of the questions that haunts everyone who learns about the Gina Emmanuel case is simply, why? Why would a registered nurse, someone trained to heal, torture children? Why would someone who operated a care facility for vulnerable adults brutalize three little girls in her own home? Why would a person inflict such cruelty on defenseless children who depended on her? These questions seek to understand evil, to find a rational explanation for behavior that seems beyond comprehension. We want to believe there's a reason, a cause, something that would explain how a human being could do such things. Because if we can understand it, maybe we can predict it, prevent it, protect against it. But the unsettling truth is that sometimes there isn't a satisfying explanation. Some people simply have the capacity for cruelty that most of us can't fathom. They lack empathy, the ability to feel another person's pain as if it were their own. They may even derive pleasure from exercising power and control over those who can't fight back. Psychologists use terms like psychopathy, sadism, and antisocial personality disorder to describe people who exhibit these traits. These aren't excuses for behavior. People with these conditions can still distinguish right from wrong and can still be held legally responsible for their actions. But they offer some framework for understanding how someone can cause horrific suffering without apparent remorse. Gina Emmanuel's complete lack of emotion throughout her arrest, interrogation, trial, and sentencing suggests someone who doesn't feel the way most people do. She showed no tears, no anguish, no recognition of the magnitude of what she had done. Even when her own daughter told her, "I wish you well in hell," Emmanuel's expression didn't change. That's not normal human response. It's also worth noting that Emmanuel's crimes weren't impulsive or reactive. This wasn't a parent who snapped under stress and lashed out in a moment of anger. Emmanuel's abuse was systematic, calculated, sustained over years. She made deliberate choices every single day to torture children. She actively isolated them to avoid detection. She used her medical knowledge to inflict pain while avoiding leaving evidence that would be visible to others. This level of premeditation suggests someone who knew exactly what she was doing, understood it was wrong, and chose to do it anyway. The legal system calls this depraved indifference to human life, acting in a way that shows complete disregard for the value of another person's life and suffering. Another disturbing aspect of the case is the contradiction between Emmanuel's professional life and her home life. At work, she cared for patients and residents. Colleagues described her as competent and professional. People who needed medical care received it from her. And then she went home and denied medical care to a dying child. How does someone compartmentalize like that? How do you provide compassionate care to strangers while torturing the children in your own home? This suggests a level of calculation and control that's deeply unsettling. Emmanuel wasn't incapable of empathy or care. She chose when to display those qualities and when to withhold them. Some experts suggest that certain abusers target children specifically because of their powerlessness. Children, especially young children removed from their biological families and isolated from community support, are ideal victims from a predator's perspective. They're physically smaller and weaker. They're emotionally dependent on their caregivers. They don't know how to access help. They can be threatened into silence. For someone who craves power and control, children in foster care and adoptive situations are particularly vulnerable. These children often already have trauma histories that may affect their behavior, making them seem difficult to outsiders who might otherwise question harsh discipline. They don't have strong connections to teachers, coaches, or community members who might notice changes in behavior or appearance. They're isolated in ways that make them perfect targets. This is why vetting people who want to foster or adopt children is so critical, and why the current system's limitations are so dangerous. We need better ways to identify people who are seeking children not to nurture them, but to victimize them. But that's extremely difficult because predators are often skilled at presenting a normal, caring facade. The Emmanuel case also raises questions about whether anyone who worked with her noticed concerning traits. Were there signs that colleagues at her job missed or dismissed? Did residents in the group home she operated receive adequate care, or were there issues there too? After her arrest, was there an investigation into her professional conduct to determine if other vulnerable individuals had been harmed? These questions haven't been fully answered publicly, though the nursing board did eventually suspend her license. But it's worth considering whether warning signs existed in other areas of her life that weren't recognized as such until after her crimes against the children came to light. Ultimately, trying to fully understand why Emmanuel did what she did may be impossible. We can use psychological frameworks, criminal behavior analysis, and trauma theory to provide some context. But at the end of the day, most people will never truly comprehend how someone could inflict such suffering on children and feel nothing. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we shouldn't be able to understand that kind of evil. Our inability to comprehend such cruelty is actually a sign of our own humanity, our own empathy, our own basic decency. The fact that we're horrified by what Emmanuel did, that we can't imagine doing such things ourselves, means our moral compass is functioning properly. What we can do is acknowledge that people like Gina Emmanuel exist. They live among us, often hiding behind respectable facades. They're nurses and teachers and coaches and foster parents, and we need systems in place to identify them and stop them before they can victimize the vulnerable people in their care. Samaya Emmanuel lived for 7 years. That's all the time she had on this earth. 7 short years that should have been filled with play and learning and love and all the beautiful things childhood is meant to hold. Instead, much of her brief life was marked by suffering. But while Samaya's life was stolen from her, her death has not been meaningless. Her case has brought attention to serious gaps in the child welfare system. It has sparked conversations about how to better protect children in foster care and after adoption. It has highlighted the need for reform. In the wake of Emmanuel's conviction, child welfare advocates have renewed calls for specific policy changes. These include extended post-adoption oversight, especially in cases where children are adopted by non-relatives and where abuse hotline reports had been filed during the foster care period. Not indefinite monitoring of all adoptive families, but targeted continued support and check-ins for situations with higher risk factors. Advocates are also pushing for mandatory school enrollment with strict oversight of homeschooling exceptions. When children are removed from school shortly after adoption, that should trigger a welfare check. Homeschooling is a legitimate educational choice for many families, but it shouldn't be used as a tool to isolate children from mandated reporters. There are also calls for better training for social workers, including how to conduct home visits that might uncover abuse that parents are trying to hide. Random, unannounced check-ins rather than scheduled visits. Interviews with children outside the presence of parents. Training to recognize subtle signs of abuse beyond obvious physical injuries. Some advocates want to see abuse hotline reports tracked more carefully across time. If multiple reports are filed about the same child, even if each individual report is unsubstantiated, the pattern itself should trigger more intensive investigation. 10 reports about one child over several years is a pattern that demands attention, regardless of whether each individual report could be proven. There are also calls for greater accountability when child welfare agencies fail to protect children. When a child dies after multiple reports were filed and not adequately investigated, there should be thorough reviews and consequences. Not to punish individual social workers who are overwhelmed and doing their best with impossible caseloads, but to identify systemic failures and administrative decisions that contributed to the tragedy. Of course, all of these reforms require resources. More social workers means higher budgets for child welfare agencies. Better training programs cost money. Technology systems to track patterns across reports require investment. Extended post-adoption oversight means more staff and more time dedicated to each case. And that's the challenge. Everyone agrees that protecting children is important, but when it comes time to allocate budget dollars, child welfare often gets shortchanged. It's not a glamorous issue. Success stories, children who are kept safe, abuse that's prevented, don't make headlines. Only the failures do, the cases like Samaya's where the system failed catastrophically. But if her case can be a catalyst for change, if it can motivate lawmakers to allocate proper funding for child welfare, if it can inspire reforms that save even one other child from a similar fate, then at least some good will have come from this tragedy. Samaya's grandfather has become an advocate since her death, speaking publicly about the need for system reform and for better protection of children in foster care and adoptive situations. He carries the burden of guilt that many family members feel in these cases, the sense that they should have done more, fought harder, found a way to bring the children home. But the reality is that the system is set up to give enormous deference to foster and adoptive parents, even over biological family members. Getting custody as a relative competing against a licensed foster parent is extremely difficult. The system often favors keeping children with their existing placements rather than moving them, even to family, because stability is considered important. This policy makes sense in many cases. Constantly moving children from home to home is traumatic, but it also means that when children are placed with abusive foster or adoptive parents, family members who recognize problems face an uphill battle to get the children back. Samaya's case has also raised awareness more broadly about child abuse, its warning signs, and the importance of reporting concerns. Many people saw news coverage of the case and were shocked to learn that 3 children were tortured for years in a Miami apartment, while neighbors and the community had no idea. This has prompted conversations about what signs of child abuse look like, how to report concerns, and the reality that abuse often happens in plain sight behind closed doors that look exactly like everyone else's doors. The case has reminded people that monsters don't look like monsters. They look like nurses and teachers and parents and neighbors. If more people understand warning signs and feel empowered to report concerns, more children might be identified and helped before situations escalate to tragedy. Education and awareness are part of protecting children, alongside systemic reforms and adequate resources for child welfare. Samaya herself never got the chance to tell her story, to speak out about what was happening to her, to advocate for herself and her sisters. But her death speaks volumes. It demands that we do better. It requires that we face uncomfortable truths about how we protect, or fail to protect, the most vulnerable among us. On November 3, 2018, a little girl named Samaya Emmanuel took her last breath. She was 7 years old. She had spent years enduring torture at the hands of the person who was supposed to protect her. She died from an illness that should have been treatable, denied medical care, by a woman whose career was devoted to providing medical care. Samaya loved animals, according to family members who remember her from before she disappeared into Gina Emmanuel's apartment. She had a bright smile and curious eyes. She was just beginning to read, just starting to discover the world. She was a child with potential, with a future, with value far beyond the suffering inflicted upon her. But all of that was stolen. Her childhood, her future, her very life, taken by someone who derived satisfaction from causing pain. And for what? There's no good reason, no explanation that makes sense, no justification that could ever be offered. What we can do is remember Samaya not just as a victim, but as a child who deserved so much better. We can honor her memory by working to protect other children, by supporting reforms to the systems that failed her, by refusing to turn away from difficult truths about child abuse. Her sisters carry on, healing and building lives that would make Samaya proud. They speak her name, remember her, ensure she isn't forgotten. They transform their pain into purpose, their suffering into survival, and eventually into thriving. Gina Emmanuel sits in a prison cell, and she will remain there until she dies. She will never harm another child. She will never know freedom again. The system that allowed her to torture children for years ultimately held her accountable. Justice, delayed but not denied, was served. But justice can't bring Samaya back. It can't erase the years of suffering she endured. It can't give her sisters back their childhood or restore their innocence. It can only ensure that the person responsible faces consequences and that other potential victims are protected from her. In the end, this case is a reminder of both the darkness that can exist in human hearts and the resilience of the human spirit. Samaya endured unimaginable suffering, but her sisters survived and are healing. Emmanuel's evil was real and horrific, but it was ultimately defeated by the courage of survivors who spoke up, investigators who pursued justice, and a legal system that, however slowly, held her accountable. Every child deserves safety, love, and the chance to grow up without fear. Samaya deserved that. Her sisters deserved that. The countless other children currently living in situations of abuse deserve that. The work of protecting children is never done. The vigilance can never cease because children cannot protect themselves. They depend entirely on the adults in their lives and on the systems we create. Samaya's life was short and filled with more pain than any child should ever endure. But she mattered. She was important. She was loved by her sisters and grandfather and extended family who tried to save her. And she will be remembered not just as a victim of a monster, but as a little girl who deserved better and whose death demands that we do better. May she rest in peace, free at last from pain and fear. May her sisters continue healing and build beautiful lives. And may we all take from this tragedy a renewed commitment to protecting the vulnerable, speaking up when we suspect abuse, and demanding that our systems work better to keep children safe. Because every child matters, every child deserves protection, and every child's life is precious beyond measure. Rest in peace, Samaya Emmanuel. You deserved so much more than this world gave you, but you will not be forgotten.